Welcome to the Center for European Studies, and welcome to this latest lecture in our ongoing series, The Conversations on Europe. This is, in fact, the second of our lectures on our theme for this year, which is Rethinking Sovereignty. My name is Joshua Cole. I'm the director of the center, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce our speaker today, David Bell. Please come in. Oh, there's Brian. Hello, Brian. David Bell is one of the most remarkable and prolific European historians of his generation. He is Sidney and Ruth Lapidus Professor in the Era of North Atlantic Revolutions and Professor of History at Princeton University, where he also received his PhD. Before assuming his current position in 2010, he was Dean of the Faculty and Andrew W. Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. He has also taught at Yale and been a visiting professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. David Bell is a specialist in the 18th and 19th century, in the history of 18th and 19th century Europe, and his earlier work really focused a great deal on France. He is the author of 3 prize-winning books and many, very many significant articles in this field. His first book, Lawyers and Citizens, The Making of a Political Elite in Old Regime France, was published in 1994 by Oxford University Press and won the Pinckney Prize from the Society for French Historical Studies as the best North American book of the year in French history. His second book, The Cult of the Nation in France, Inventing Nationalism, 1680 to 1800, was published by Harvard University Press in 2003, and this book was awarded the Leo Gershoy Prize by the American Historical Association for the best book of the year on 17th and 18th century European history. His third book, The First Total War, Napoleon's Europe and the Birth of War as We Know It, was published in 2007 by Houghton Mifflin and subsequently translated into French, Portuguese, and Spanish, and it also won a prize, the Louis Gottschalk Prize from the American Society for 18th Century Studies. Among European historians, David is well known for the incisiveness of his writing, for his intellectual broad-mindedness, and for his generosity towards other scholars, and in particular toward younger scholars. He is well known beyond the university as well for his frequent contributions to contemporary debates about French politics, debates about European integration, debates about the uses of military technology and their effects. He is a frequent contributor to non-academic publications. He's perhaps best known for regular contributions to the New Republic magazine. He's also frequently published commentary in European press, in Le Point and Die Zeit, also online publications such as Slate. In other words, we're extremely fortunate to have him today before us. The title of his lecture today is The Birth of Militarism in the Age of Revolutions. Please join me in welcoming David Bell.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm really delighted to be here in Ann Arbor. I want to thank Josh Cole for his kind invitation. What I'm going to do in this talk is present some preliminary thoughts, really, from a new book project, which the title of the book, at least tentatively, is going to be Men on Horseback, Militarism and Charismatic Authority in the Age of Democratic Revolutions. And this is going to deal with part of it. It builds on some themes that I first explored in my book, The First Total War. And it has sort of the same broad subject, which is the intersection of war, military life, and political culture. But it's also going to go off in some new directions. So, in the year 1813, as Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was crumbling, the Swiss French writer, I should say, Benjamin Constant, issued one of the earliest and most powerful condemnations of what we would today call militarism. It was highly dangerous, he warned, to create in a country, and I'm quoting here, to create in a country a large mass of men imbued with an exclusively military spirit. And he continued by asking if these men at the end of a war would shed their attitudes along with their uniforms. To the contrary, and I'm quoting again, those without weapons strike them as an ignoble mob. Laws strike them as useless subtleties. Opposition strikes them as disorder, and reasoning strikes them as revolt. And Constant insisted that in a modern world of constitutional regimes and commerce, that a military spirit of conquest, to use the title of his brochure, was a menacing vestige of an earlier age. Now, 200 years later, Constant's words still seem to ring true. Most modern observers continue to see militarism not merely as a danger to modern democratic societies, but as something entirely antithetical to modern democratic societies from both theoretical and historical perspectives. Emil Durkheim wrote in Suicide, and I quote, "Military morality is a vestige. It resembles the morality of primitive societies." And I think this remark would still find quite a bit of support today, even among those who have grown uncomfortable with the adjective primitive. The sociologist Hans Joas has argued that because of militarism's perceived anachronistic qualities, social scientists and historians have, for the most part, given it relatively little attention. And in fact, the historians who have done the most to investigate the history of militarism are perhaps, not surprisingly, historians of Germany. They have concentrated their efforts heavily on the question of Germany's special historical path to modernity, what is called in German the Sonderweg, and the way that a supposedly precocious German militarism can help perhaps explain the pathologies of the 20th century. And in particular, they often trace militarism back to a regime that was one of the least imaginable seedbeds of modern democracy, namely absolutist Prussia. Now, in the book that I'm writing, I'm going to offer a rather different interpretation of the birth of modern militarism. I'm going to argue that far from representing a vestige, a survival of an earlier age that only rears its ugly head when constitutional regimes fail, the most common forms of modern militarism, in fact, had their origins directly in the age of democratic revolutions and of revolutionary war, and are actually, in many ways, symbiotically related to the regimes that emerged from these revolutions, including regimes that we don't necessarily consider democratic, such as the Napoleonic Empire. The book itself is going to be broad in its geographical and chronological scope, probably too broad. I'm probably being a bit foolhardy here. It will range from Corsica in France to Haiti in South America, while also touching in some ways on the United States. It will discuss some of the more familiar personalities of the Age of Revolutions. But I'm not going to try to do all of that, obviously, in a short talk today. I want to focus more on the general theoretical issues and then on the case of France, which I do know the best and I think has a very strong importance in this general story. Now, in 1921, a German essayist, one of these people obsessed with the origins of militarism and with its relationship to Germany, offered a very useful and often repeated definition of militarism. This is Friedrich Sterntal, the German essayist of the 1920s. And he called militarism, and I'm quoting here, "the subordination of all other aspects of life to the military one, the domination of civilian life by military ideas and values." He himself particularly associated militarism with Germany's Second Empire. But if you define militarism in this way, and I think it is an interesting definition, you can see where it has played a central role in the history of societies across the world. And where it has flourished, it has also generally involved an assertion of the moral superiority supposedly conferred by military service, thanks to the association of military service with three distinct qualities: strength, discipline, and selflessness, including especially the readiness of warriors to die for their countries. Now, Sterntal, like most students of this subject, assumed that militarism is at least potentially a universal phenomenon, something that's capable of arising in just about any society that has organized armed forces, or maybe even disorganized armed forces. But is this really the case? His definition assumes a distinction that we now today see as natural and take utterly for granted, so that historians use these terms almost without thinking about all kinds of past societies. And these are the terms military and civilian, and that the human societies can always be divided into distinct and opposed military and civilian spheres. My starting point for this project is that past societies have not, in fact, always recognized this distinction in the way that we do today, and they haven't organized themselves on this basis in ways that moderns would find familiar. In fact, I'd argue that in the modern West, the particular way that we make this distinction really only emerged in the age of democratic revolutions. Only in this period did it become possible, I think, to conceive of ideas, values, and practices that could be labeled distinctly military and contrasted to values, ideas, and practices labeled civilian, and that you could see the military values imposing themselves on civilian values in what we can now call militarism. So, in other words, the conceptual basis for militarism was not really in place. Now, I don't mean to suggest that if you have this distinction that militarism is the obvious corollary, that it's the obvious consequence of it, but the distinction itself helps engender a potential for militarism, which can be very difficult to overcome. Now, let me be very clear about what I'm arguing here, because talking about it in this abstract way can give rise to some misconceptions. Obviously, I'm not arguing that military forces themselves did not exist as distinct institutions before the Age of Revolutions, or that they were not perceived as such. Of course they were. I'm not arguing that military service was not identified as a distinct vocation, and an honorable one. Of course it was. What I'm arguing is something different, namely that societies as a whole were not seen as being divided into separate parts that can be, and potentially competing parts or complementary parts that can be labeled military and civilian, each possessing its own distinct and opposing set of values and practices. Now, just to put a little more flesh on these bones here, and to give one of the most telling pieces of evidence, I think, we can actually go back and look at some interesting uses of language. We can, of course, ourselves go back and look at past societies and classify their inhabitants as military or civilian according to our own definitions, the ones that we use in our everyday lives in the modern world. Yet in the English language, the word civilian did not exist with its modern meaning before 1794. That is the first recorded meaning. Until then, the word existed, but it signified only an expert in civil law, which is to say an expert in Roman law. In other words, if you talked about a civilian in 18th century England or the United States, you were meaning an expert in Roman law. A similar situation prevailed in German and French, where words with what we now see as the meaning civilian first made their recorded appearances in 1790 and in 1834, respectively. In French, I'm speaking here of the noun civil as opposed to the adjective civil, which of course has a very long but different history. And in German, I'm talking about the word civiliste. So the concept of civilian life that we should throw around so easily today, for instance, when we talk about civilian victims of war, civilian control of the armed forces, and so on and so forth, that was not part of common parlance in the early modern world. Now, the reason for this absence becomes somewhat more clear, I think, when we start to map out the relationship between the modern concept of military and civilian and two of the great prominent models of social order that early modern Europeans had at their disposal. Now, the first and classic model of social order, stretching back to the Middle Ages, is the model of the three estates: clergy, nobility, and commons, which were often defined as those who pray, those who fight, and those who toil, those who labor. Now, in one sense, we could certainly think of the second estate, the nobility, as a military sphere, and then the other two, in some ways, as a civilian sphere in opposition to them. It's true that by the 18th century, many European male nobles, did not serve in the military. Some countries, such as France, had entire categories of nobility attached to non-military callings, such as the judiciary. Still, overall, the links between nobility and military service were very strong and clear right down to the end of the 18th century. In Prussia, a large majority of nobles did serve. The same was true throughout most of Central Europe. In France, when there were elections to the actual representatives of the Second Estate with the Estates General of 1789 at the beginning of the French Revolution, 80% of those elected to the noble estate had military experience. On the other hand, the Second Estate could hardly be considered identical with the military, because it didn't include, most obviously, common soldiers. And while it had its distinct values and practices, these were not imagined in any way to be in competition with the values and practices of the other two estates, the clergy and the commons, because the model of the three estates was a functional model. Each estate had its own function within the greater body social. To suggest that commoners should adopt the values and practices of the Second Estate would have been rather, in theory, would have been rather nonsensical, rather like asking that an arm behave like an ear. Now, the other great model to which Europeans had access was the model of the ancient republic, and particularly the Roman Republic, as seen here, dramatized by Jacques-Louis David in his wonderful painting, The Oath of the Horatii of 1784. Now, in this model, the model that the Europeans learned about the Roman Republic, every citizen was potentially a soldier, ready to sacrifice his life for the fatherland. Therefore, in theory, this model permitted no division whatsoever between what we would now call civilian and military spheres. They were a seamlessly united civic whole. So we see already in these two models how difficult it is to adjust these to our modern notions of military and civilian. I do need, however, to go on just a little bit further about republics, because, of course, that story of the ancient republics would get considerably more complicated, and it actually plays quite a strong role in the story I'm going to be telling here today. Because in the early modern European imagination, the story of the ancient republics, particularly the Roman Republic, was a story of corruption. It was a story of decline, of degeneration. The age of Junius Brutus, the age of the Horatii, portrayed here so heroically, gave way to the age of Sulla and Marius, Pompey, and Caesar. As the story went, as Rome expanded, its armies became divorced from the civic life of the Republic. Soldiers felt more loyalty to their generals than to the city. And finally, Caesar brought his army of Gaul back across the Rubicon, extinguishing Republican liberty and eventually the Republic itself. This process of degeneration could be seen as a project, as a process of distinction, of sorting out, as the life of the military became detached from the life of the city of Rome, until the two existed as separate and perhaps even opposing entities. Now, this belief in what had happened to the Roman Republic made up a crucial plank of what historians now think of as early modern classical republican language. And it goes straight back to that unparalleled admirer of the Roman Republic that was Machiavelli. And I put up some of the Italian text here. This is how he begins his 1520 Art of War, with the words, "Many are of the opinion that no two things go less well with one another, or are less similar, than military life and civil life." So here, Machiavelli, too, seems to be drawing a distinction between civilian and military. But of course, as a good Republican, Machiavelli saw the distinction as an unnatural one. He called it bad and corrupt. He linked it to the decadence of the Italian city-states of his own day, and particularly to their practice of hiring foreign mercenaries, rather than forming true citizen armies. The idea that civil life, as he called it, the vita civile, when divorced from military service, could still have any coherence or unity or value to it, was simply anathema to him. So again, this is still not the military-civilian distinction as we understand it today. And the process, I think, comes through even more graphically when we look at how Machiavelli was translated in early modern Europe, and particularly in early modern England. In modern translations of The Art of War, his word civile tends to be translated always simply as civilian, using a word that did not exist in English, certainly in his time. But if you look at this translation from 18th century England, you see that civile is translated as civil, as common, as of a citizen. Clearly, the translator doesn't know what to do with this little word civile, and does not have a concept of civilian, as the modern translators do, that can simply be applied to it. So again, simply to show you how tricky these language issues can be. So again, to come back to the main point here, neither of the great models of social organization that were available to early modern Europeans allowed them really to think the military-civilian distinction in quite the way we do today. The Republican way of doing it, and particularly the story told of degeneration, of corruption, would help Europeans rethink the place of the military in society, and I'll go into that in a minute. But certainly, the Republican language itself is really not equivalent to a modern sense of a distinction between opposing separate military and civilian spheres. I want to stress that this absence of the modern distinction was not just a matter of language. It was not just a matter of semantics. It was a matter of very real social practices. Today, when we think of the military, we immediately envision what can be called an entire infrastructure of difference. Barracks, bases, educational institutions such as military academies, but also military schools, military law codes and legal systems, distinctive forms of dress, and so on and so forth. Not to mention, in the United States, very limited geographical recruitment. But this infrastructure of difference was only beginning to emerge in the 17th and 18th centuries. Yes, of course, armies and navies by this point existed as distinct institutions, with their own rules, their own structures, even sometimes their own forms of speech. But officers in particular did not really draw sharp lines between their military roles and their social identity as nobles. And I want to stress here that while, as I've already said, military service was certainly a crucial component of what it was seen as to be as what it seemed to be a noble, what it meant to be a noble, it was by no means the only component of noble identity, and the lines between the different components of noble identity were not always clear. In Europe, most noble officers spent much of the year, even majority of the year, apart from the regiments, at court or on their estates. In some countries, until quite late, even in the 18th century, officers disdained wearing military uniforms, even in campaigns. Relatively few of them had still what we would call formal military training. The military schools of the century that were just beginning to arise did not train most of the French army until very late. Values and forms of behavior, in short, remain strikingly the same across what we call the twin theaters of noble life that were on the one hand royal courts, and on the other hand, the officer corps on campaign. In practice, nobles slipped back frictionlessly between what we would now call their military and civilian roles. For common soldiers, the situation was quite different. Their situation was much more separate, and yet the tone is set to a very large extent by the officer corps. Another important point to consider is that before the Age of Revolutions, it was almost impossible to think of European armies as sources of independent political power and as institutions that based a political power upon their military identity. Now, in our own intellectual universe, in which military and civilian values and practices are not only seen as existing separately from each other, but potentially competing with each other, it is all too easy to think of military figures acting to impose their own values and practices on the political world, most graphically through military coups d'états. Early modern Europeans were, of course, familiar with this idea. They knew the story of Julius Caesar, but they saw it as having very little relevance to the societies in which they themselves lived. The aristocratic leaders of European armies saw the most important elements of their own vocations as being absolute loyalty to the sovereign. Was a military coup imaginable in the France of Louis XIV? Would it have made the least sense there to talk of civilian control of the military? Obviously not. The two things were fused together far too tightly. Even in Prussia, where the military certainly played an outsized role in domestic government, it did so as part of the royal administration, under firm control of the king and his ministers, not as an autonomous political force in the way that the German army would much later become an autonomous political force. Now, we can talk about one possible exception to this obvious exception to this pattern in early modern Europe, Oliver Cromwell's New Model Army, which certainly did emerge as an independent force during the British Civil Wars. But its political independence developed because of the independent political and religious groups that found a home in its ranks. It did not press its claims as an army. That is to say, its spokesman did not argue that specifically military qualities gave it any sort of legitimacy in comparison with what we would now call the civilian authorities. So while it certainly was an interesting precedent that would be cited later by many people warning against militarism, I do not really see it as an example of militarism already in the 17th century. And in fact, more broadly, I would take issue with historians who have discerned the origins of modern militarism in old regime Europe, even in old regime Prussia. Yes, Prussia's king Friedrich Wilhelm I famously fetishized the army. He himself almost always wore a simple officer's uniform. As I've just mentioned, Prussia integrated military officers and practices into domestic political administration to an unusual extent. It was these practices that certainly encouraged an older generation of German historians, particularly German emigres, to conclude, and I'm quoting Hans Rosenberg, one of them here, that, quote, martial concepts of authority and military virtues served as models for civilian life in general. And it was very easy to generalize from the role of the officers in domestic administration. But more recent historians of early modern Germany, such as Peter Wilson, have argued strongly against this interpretation. They've suggested that Prussian rulers did not, in fact, make serious efforts to extend the regimentation of the state apparatus, of the very weak state apparatus that was strengthened by the addition of a kind of military component. They did not extend this to society in general. And in fact, they argue that Prussian practices represented should be seen rather as a kind of extreme example of the so-called well-ordered police state that flourished throughout absolutist continental Europe and that contained a seamless mixture of what we would now define as military and civilian elements. The police in question was not identified as particularly military, either in origin or character. So if we wanted to look at early modern Prussia, the phrase I would use to describe it would be to say that it was very much a bellicose society, perhaps a martial society in some ways, but not a militarist one in the sense that military values were determining the texture and course of civilian life. I don't think that concept works for early modern Prussia. And while it's understandable that the emigre historians would have wanted to see this as the origin of so many of Germany's miseries, I don't think the case can really stand up. Now, what I'd like to turn to now is the large-scale changes, which in effect scrambled the ways Europeans envisaged the relationship between military service and society as a whole, and made possible the modern distinction between military life and civilian life, and therefore also made possible modern militarism. Now, these changes were both material and intellectual. A driving force, a powerful force, was certainly the development of large standing armies. If you look at France in 1500, so in the French Renaissance, the king could muster at best a few tens of thousands of soldiers from many different sources, including quite heavily foreign mercenaries. There did not yet exist really a single unified institution that could be labeled the French army in the way that we talk about armies today. 200 years later, under Louis XIV, this institution, the French army, existed. It was permanent, and during wartime its numbers could swell to around 400,000, with soldiers now identified by ranks, wearing uniforms, following a military law code, and written rules of discipline. And over the next century, there followed the beginnings of the development of this infrastructure of difference that I've already mentioned. Barracks, military schools, and at least where common soldiers were concerned, a very recognizable separation from the rest of French society. At the same time, as a great professor at University of Michigan, David Bien, and many of his students demonstrated throughout their careers, a discourse of military professionalism was beginning to develop in France with the goal of turning the noble officer corps into something more closely resembling a full-time profession, one which one entered after a period of formal training. And this process had equivalents in most major European countries, although it was still really only getting started at the time of the French Revolution in many ways. There were many elements of the French army which entirely resisted it, including the most elite elements. Now, this material change throughout Europe, not just France, provided fodder for two crucial intellectual changes that were already taking place. Now, the first of these was the further development of a classical republican language of political opposition, especially in the Anglophone world, although it had some echoes in France in the struggles between the judicial parliaments and the crown there. Now, as John Pocock emphasized many years ago, from a classical republican viewpoint, nothing was more unnatural or abhorrent than a standing professional army. This was Machiavelli's viewpoint already, as we have seen. And in the late 17th and 18th centuries, British Whigs harped on the theme ever more relentlessly as the British military expanded and as fears grew that a despotic monarch might use it to curtail the liberties of the people. And one need think only of the famous pamphlets by John Trenchard on the danger of standing armies and the large literature that followed. In Britain's American colonies, this criticism became even more pointed as the authority of the British Crown was challenged in the 1760s and 1770s, and then as the British government responded by sending red-coated troops to American cities to restore order. In 1774, just at the moment that the governor of Massachusetts was being replaced by General Thomas Gage, the future American revolutionary Josiah Quincy could write, and I'm quoting, "What a deformed monster is a standing army in a free nation." So this is then the first intellectual development. The second one was of a different order. Over the course of the 18th century, an increasingly influential series of thinkers developed a critique of war itself as a practice. This was not the venerable Christian pacifism, which decried war as a sin even while recognizing its inevitability, given sinful humanity. This was a theoretical and historical critique grounded in what are called stadial theories of history, according to which human societies naturally evolve away from a martial bellicose stage and become steadily more polite, more sophisticated, more commercial, more peaceful. The distinctiveness of the wars fought by the period's new standing armies certainly contributed to and sharpened this critique. It gave ammunition, if I may use the figure of speech, to Louis XIV's great critic Fénelon, the author of Télémaque, which you see here, to the Abbé Saint-Pierre, the author of A Project for Perpetual Peace, to Baron d'Holbach, and eventually to Immanuel Kant in his own Project for Perpetual Peace of 1795, and even then to Benjamin Constant, with whom I started the lecture. Along the way, this critique also frequently expanded into a critique of the ideas of valor, of honor, and of nobility associated with the Second Estate, with nobles. Here is a line from Baron d'Holbach's 1776 book, Universal Morality, quote, "The glory associated with conquest, war, and valor in almost all countries is a visible remnant of the savage customs that prevailed in all nations before they were civilized. The deadly profession of war has been reputed the most noble, but this is thanks to a series of mistaken opinions handed down by our barbarian ancestors." Again, very similar in some ways to what Constant said. And already this is in 1776. Now, what's particularly interesting for my purposes about this critique and about the stadial theories of history that they're connected with is that their vision of a polite, commercial, and peaceful society is also, in fact, a vision of a civilian society. It's a society in which war and the martial values associated with it have no place. The historical distinction that these authors drew between primitive martial societies on the one hand and modern pacific ones on the other is precisely a distinction between a military society and a civilian society, military and civilian forms of life. Here's Benjamin Constant again. "It's not true that war is always an evil. During certain periods of human history, it was in the nature of man. But the world of our day is, from this perspective, the precise opposite of the ancient world," to emphasize the precise opposite. A government that today would speak of military glory as a goal, misunderstanding the spirit of the age. It would be engaging in a crude and deadly anachronism. Now, taken together, these critiques began to radically reframe the way that Europeans were understanding the relationship between war and society in this new age of large standing armies. With classical republicanism and the Whig fears of a British king using the army to curtail the liberties of the people, it became possible now for the first time to think of the Roman Republic and of Caesarism not simply as a piece of ancient history that might have moral lessons, but in fact as a model with very direct relevance to the societies of the day. And with the development of stadial theories and 18th century Enlightened pacifism, it became possible to conceive of civilian societies as in some senses being the opposite of military ones, each operating according to their own driving principles, their own dynamics, with their own distinct values and practices. Now, I would argue that these developments that I've just been sketching out played a crucial role in the period's democratic revolutions. These revolutions, of course, directly challenged the sovereignty of the monarchs who had previously bound civil and military authority so tightly together in their own persons. And I'm glad I can at least touch on the theme of sovereignty, which is your theme for the year here. They also challenged or even overthrew, these revolutions did, the aristocratic elites who had so seamlessly combined what we now think of as military and civilian roles. They posed in the starkest possible terms the problem of who would now control the military forces necessary for the defense of large modern nation states. And in facing these challenges, the leaders of the revolutionary movements initially drew on the critiques I've just been discussing. In the United States, it's a very familiar story. From the very start of pre-revolutionary agitation in the 1760s, the actions of the British Standing Army were, as we've already seen with a quote from Quincy, seen as one of the principal abuses that in fact would come to justify American independence. You only have to look at the Declaration of Independence itself, not the stirring early lines, but in the long line of charges that Jefferson hurled against King George III, and which reprised earlier works that he himself had written I'll just quote, "He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures." And still more, "He has effected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power." The Americans explicitly cast their own continental army as a different sort of beast. It would be much more a sort of civilian militia writ large, and it was not anticipated that a large standing army would need to remain in existence after the end of the War for Independence. And this was not simply because of a classical Republican belief that the soldiers would return to their farms along with their general, the modern Cincinnatus, George Washington. Because some Americans, just like the European thinkers I just mentioned, in fact themselves believed that the age of war was coming steadily to an end. And I could quote here on this subject none other than, in fact, George Washington himself, who discussed the issue at length with a French officer, the Marquis de Chastellux, who had served in the French army in the Americas during the War of Independence, and whom Washington had a long correspondence with. And I'll quote Washington writing to Chastellux in 1788. "It's time for the age of knight-errantry and mad heroism to be at an end. For the sake of humanity, it is devoutly to be wished that the manly employment of agriculture and the humanizing benefits of commerce would supersede the waste of war and the rage of conquest." In 1787 to 89, when the new American Constitution was debated, the relationship of what we can now fairly call civilian and military spheres was a central concern, as with the question of who has the right to declare war, who is commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and so on and so forth. Now in France, in its own revolution, as soon as challenges to the sovereignty of the king developed in 1788-89, we can chart strikingly parallel developments, and especially after King Louis XVI in the summer of 1789 responded to the actions of the new Revolutionary National Assembly by concentrating troops around the city of Paris. Now this was ended, of course, by the rising of the city of Paris on the 14th of July, the taking of the Bastille, and this dispersed the immediate threat of a military strike. But from then on, much of the revolutionary movement in France saw the Royal Army in the worst possible light. In December of 1789, when the deputy Edmond du Bois-Conseil made a series of proposals for reforming the French armed forces, he characterized the army in these terms. I'm quoting, "They are men without a fatherland or fixed domicile. They are controlled only by a severe and often unjust discipline. They are governed by a despotic regime." One of the most prominent newspapers of the time, the Revolutions of Paris, Révolution de Paris, warned almost daily about the dangers of something that had not even been imaginable in France 2 years before, namely a military coup. In one issue, after conjuring up the shade of Julius Caesar, it commented, "The army is patriotic today. It is enlightened." This is because soldiers had actually participated in the action of against the Bastille. But the newspaper continued, "Will the army still be patriotic and enlightened in a century? After all, isn't a victorious leader almost always the idol of his soldiers?" So again, we see here in France too, with the coming of the revolution, a much stronger perception of the military as a separate sphere, and potentially as an independent political power, than had ever been the case just a couple of years before the revolution. And as in the United States, the obvious preferred solution to the problem was to replace a standing royal army with a citizen army. The slogan, repeated endlessly across the French pamphlet literature of the time, was to make every citizen a soldier, every soldier a citizen. In 1793, just a year after France actually went to war against most of Europe, the revolutionary government actually tried to implement this principle with the so-called levée en masse, the mass levy that in theory declared every healthy adult male susceptible for army service. But the critiques didn't actually even stop with these warnings about Caesarism, so redolent of the Whig critique and the Republican critique of standing armies. Many revolutionaries also denounced even the project of forming a national guard and a citizen army. They thought this was just as silly. When military-style uniforms were proposed for the new National Guard, and you see here a sketch where you see a National Guardsman with other soldiers, all clearly wearing very strongly military-styled uniforms, the radical newspapers actually howled about this. Jean-Paul Marat, no less, the angel of the terror, attacked what he called the ridiculous project of trying to transform the French into a people of soldiers. That's a quote. "Surely the age of soldiers was past," he wrote. In France, as in the United States, when a new constitution was written between 1789 and 91, control of the armed forces became a major point of contention, in debates over how the Constitution would be written. Who had the right to declare war? The king? The National Assembly? Who had the right to approve military funding? The debates in France, however, went even further than they did in the United States. When the issue arose, it was in May of 1790, speaker after speaker, starting with none other than Maximilien Robespierre, declared that war itself was in fact a relic of the past, and that a fraternally minded modern nation should actually abhor warfare altogether. They repeated in these debates ad nauseum that commerce had changed the face of the world, and that therefore that really what France should do is declare peace to the world. Now, the issue of whether the king or the assembly, about whom should control the armed forces, that ended in a fairly muddy compromise. But accompanying it was what the revolutionaries quickly dubbed the Declaration of Peace to the World, a promise that France would never launch a war of aggression, a promise they kept for almost 24 months. The deputies, however, if we think about it, and we think about it in terms of this critique of the stadial theories of history that I've been outlining, the deputies were in fact committing themselves to making France a civilian society. Now, at this point, then, in the twin Atlantic revolutions, we could say that a somewhat paradoxical situation had emerged. A specter was haunting Europe, the specter of militarism, haunting the United States too, but it was only a specter, because nowhere did militarism yet really exist as a political phenomenon. People were scared of it, but there wasn't yet anything much to be scared of. In the United States, Caesar did in turn turn out to be Cincinnatus. George Washington gave up his military command, and this act of renunciation became the basis of his legend, later reinforced by his surrender of the presidency. The closest the United States came to any attempt by the military to intervene directly in politics was not really very close. It was the muddy and abortive Newburgh conspiracy. In France as well, during the first 5 years of the revolution, no general came close to filling the role that the Cassandras were warning about. Lafayette may have contemplated using the army against the revolutionary government as the government turned more radical, but he never tried. General Dumouriez, one of his successors, the victor of Valmy in 1792, he did repeatedly disobey the orders of the civilian government in Paris, and then in early 1793, he did try to incite his armies to march on Paris and seize power, but they refused. And like Lafayette before him, he had to flee across the lines to the enemy. During the Reign of Terror, and it shows just how deeply this fear of militarism still struck, no fewer than 84 French generals died on the guillotine, one of the professions that was probably even worse than priest to have in 1789 was general, if you wanted a long life expectancy. Some were executed for alleged incompetence, but many were accused of designs on power, and the names of Caesar and Cromwell as well appeared in indictment after indictment before the Revolutionary Tribunal. So the specter of militarism did in fact produce many ghosts. But in the course of the revolutionary period, we can see another intellectual development at work, one which finally allowed the specter to take on some flesh. Now at this point it was certainly possible, I'm arguing, to see, for people to see the military as a distinct sphere of modern society, one that existed in diametrical opposition to a civilian sphere. And again, it's no coincidence, I think, that the word civilian starts to be used in the modern meaning at this time. But those who acknowledged the distinction did so in one of two ways, as I've suggested. Either they saw this division between military and civilian as a kind of corrupt and unnatural division of what should really be a seamless whole, a seamless civic republican whole, or they saw the military half of things as an anachronistic relic of barbarous times, the two intellectual trends I was discussing before. But at the end of the 18th century, a different idea arose, an idea that the military could be a redemptive and regenerating force, a force that could, far from threatening civil society, become its salvation. Now, this final transformation took place in many ways as a reaction against the stadial theories of history that saw war as an anachronism. And they owed a great deal to the question posed above all by Jean-Jacques Rousseau of what might be lost by the advance of peaceful civilization. This reaction did not come from a new and distinct intellectual party. It came rather from within the same Enlightenment universe that the critics of war largely came from. It was perfectly possible, in fact, to prophesy perpetual peace with the one hand and to worry about its consequences with the other. Consider these words, first published in 1790, and I'm quoting, "The sublime needs violence. War itself has something sublime about it, and it makes the disposition of the people who carry it on only the more sublime, the more dangers they are exposed to. By contrast, a long peace generally brings about a predominantly commercial spirit, and along with it, a low selfishness, cowardice, and effeminacy. And who is this? It's none other than Immanuel Kant. But in this case, obviously not from his project for perpetual peace, but from his earlier critique of judgment. 11 years earlier, the German scholar Johann Valentin Emser had praised war as a necessary phenomenon without which noble sentiments would wither and die. He wrote, "War rejuvenates the people." And in 1792, the writer and statesman Wilhelm von Humboldt called war, and I'm quoting here, one of the healthiest phenomena for the cultivation of the human race. He continued, "It's unwillingly that I see war disappearing more and more from the scene." He had nothing to worry about. "It is the admittedly fearful extreme through which active courage is tested and steeled." During the French Revolution, much the same language appeared in France, especially among the Girondin advocates for war against Austria. Madame Roland, for instance, criticized what she called, and I'm quoting, "the flighty character and corrupt or frivolous mores of the French. Peace," she said, "is taking us backwards. We can only be regenerated by blood." Now, I think what's important to recognize about this exaltation of war is that it was itself something rather distinct and I think rather new. Although it certainly involved an idolization of the ancients, as with Humboldt, it was not simply the traditional association of military service with civic virtue. And although it made use of the languages of honor and glory, it went well beyond the languages of noble valor that had been central to the self-image of the Second Estate since the Middle Ages. It had, I think, for lack of a better word, a kind of mystical quality that saw combat and sacrificial death as moments of transcendence, but not religious transcendence, in the service of any divine plan. It was a secular transcendence linked to that quintessential 18th century word that Kant used in the passage I just quoted, namely the sublime. And it did not simply involve the distinction between military and civilian spheres, as we can now call them. It involved a deprecation of civilian life in general. And I think that, too, is really quite new in this period. In early modern Europe, you can certainly find endless cases of writers eloquently praising military service as honorable, as valorous, as healthy, as pleasant, as virtuous, and comparing it favorably to other professions. You just have to open Montaigne to see this. But you do not see civilian life as a whole denounced as selfish, cowardly, effeminate, debased, as Immanuel Kant himself would do in 1790. In other words, hardly had the concept of civilian life made its way into the world than it was being traduced in this manner. To touch the face of the sublime, you could not be peaceful. You had to struggle, you had to fight, you had to risk sacrificial death. And I can think of no image that better expresses this idea than David's remarkable painting of 1794, The Death of Joseph Barras. Barras was a young boy, called a revolutionary, we don't really know, killed during the revolt of the Vendée in western France. This is a revolt against the French revolutionary government. David strips the scene of all particularity, and he presents Barras as an androgynous object of desire. And this same infusion of sexuality into representations of combat and sacrificial death would figure with increased intensity in the poetry and art of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. Just because I don't have much time left, I'll just say it culminates with the figure of the Austrian poet Theodor Körner, who died fighting for Prussia against Napoleon, and who incidentally became a favorite of the Nazis. It's worth quoting a few lines from his posthumous collection, Lyre and Sword. "Honor is the wedding guest, the fatherland is the bride. He who lustfully embraces her has married death itself. True happiness," Körner insisted, "could only be found in sacrificial death. Nur in dem Opfertod heift uns das Glück," to quote the original, rather horrifying German. So, in France, after the end of the Terror, this developing mystique of war allowed new sorts of claims to be made for the moral superiority of actual military institutions. If war could rejuvenate, if it could heal, if it could redeem a debased and degenerate civilian society, then the principal vector of this process was, in fact, the army. Now, in France, these claims were made in an unusual twist by the Jacobin left. In 1789, as we've seen, the predecessors to the Jacobin left had been the ones warning most loudly about the dangers of Caesarism. 8 years later, the situation was very different. The armies had been purged of the royalist elements. Nearly all the old noble officer corps had either fled or been executed. The old units of the line had been amalgamated with revolutionary volunteers. Meanwhile, back in Paris, conservative and even royalist forces were winning elections in the summer of 1797. In response, one of the leading neo-Jacobins declared that the Republic now, in fact, had taken refuge in the armies. And the radical newspapers went further. They denounced civilian politics as corrupt and debased, as ruining the country. One of them insisted, and I'll quote, "The great flood was necessary to purge the earth. The armies will be necessary to purify France." And there followed, as early as the summer of 1797, what I would actually call the first real military coup in Western European history. This was the late summer coup of Fructidor, and you see here, in fact, armed soldiers invading the assembly chamber in Paris. Now, with soldiers marching into the capital, the right-wing directors and members of the assembly who'd been elected the previous summer were purged. Hundreds of political opponents were imprisoned or deported to French Guiana, and where once it had been the left warning against the dangers of militarism and Caesarism, now it was the right. It was the royalist newspapers that harped on the theme of military despotism, asked if the Rubicon was being crossed, and predicted the coming of what they called, rather unanimously, une république militaire, a military republic. Now, the great beneficiary of these developments, needless to say, was Napoleon Bonaparte. It was not simply that he was a popular general who would take advantage of chaos to overthrow a weak and unstable regime. And already, incidentally, in 1797-98, he was ostentatiously disobeying the government's orders, defying civilian control when it suited him. But there was much more. He was the new mystique of war personified. He was the Humboldt's admittedly fearful extreme in the flesh. In the Italian campaign of 1796-97, he had acquired the most brilliant reputation of any French general for centuries. And more, he was supremely talented at using the media, as we could now call it, the press, but also artists and newspapers that he himself personally founded, to create an image for himself. And this image was precisely that of the exceptional man, perfectly suited for a new, exceptional, sublime warfare. The portrait that he commissioned from Gros of himself at the Battle of Arcola, which you see here, is one obvious example. I've also put up here the description of him from his newspaper, The Courier of the Army of Italy. He flies like lightning and strikes like thunder. The speed of his movements excludes neither precision nor prudence. He is everywhere. He sees everything. He is like a shooting star streaking across the sky. And very early on, Napoleon presented himself not simply as a military hero in this vein, but as a political redeemer. During the parade celebrating Bastille Day in 1797 in occupied Milan, he staged a remarkable incident, which his newspaper, of course, duly reported. A soldier stepped out of the ranks and shouted, "General, you have saved France. Your children who glory in belonging to your invincible army will make you a rampart of their bodies. Now go and save the Republic." So by 1797, he was precisely the sort of idol that the newspaper The Revolutions of Paris had warned about 9 years before, and not just an idol of the soldiers, but in fact of much of the French population. To them he embodied what I would call an alternate form of democratic legitimacy, whereby his qualities of strength, of discipline, of selflessness, military qualities, were held to supply what the political class, what the civilian political class, was believed so sorely to lack. He and his men would be the active agents who would regenerate all of France through their glory. And these qualities, it needs to be stressed, allowed him to succeed not only where previous generals had failed, but where in fact all previous French revolutionary leaders had failed, namely in gaining a durable personal following without falling victim to charges of acting in the service of pure selfish personal ambition. Again, being selfless, being ready to give up your life for your country helps in this manner. And 2 years later, after further military exploits in Egypt, he would in fact seize power. It was another military coup, and it put in power for the first time in Western European history what can fairly be called a militarist regime. And I'll just finish with a couple of remarks about this, because this is a point actually which has been much disputed, especially in France. For a long time, many French historians, particularly those on the left, liked to read Napoleon the way Marx read his nephew, as an agent of the bourgeoisie. Right-wing historians, meanwhile, cast him as the heir of all the worst tendencies of the French Revolution. So both of them, therefore, both sides, tended to cooperate, rather strangely, in stressing the civilian basis of his rule. They repeatedly quoted his assertion that he was the most civilian of generals, le plus civil des généraux, that he did not intend to govern as a general. These citations actually show how thoroughly Bonaparte himself could now see societies divided into military and civilian spheres. The historians argued that he won power where other generals failed because he cultivated civilian support. And the historian Patrice Guénifé, who's just published a big new biography of Napoleon, insists at great length that Napoleon did not impose a dictatorship of the sword, to use his phrase. When I presented a version of this paper in Paris 2 weeks ago, Guénifé was there and blew a very large gasket. But I think that denying the militarism of Napoleon's regime is a pretty big exercise in wishful thinking. He did not win power because of his civilian qualities. There was no other general whose reputation came anywhere close to his. They won some large battles. He conquered Italy and Egypt. His triumphal return to France from Egypt in the fall of 1799 was one long celebration of his military triumphs. It helped that nobody knew what a disaster the Egyptian campaign would become. In Lyon, he was greeted with a stage play called The Return of the Hero. In Paris, the coup, which took place just a few weeks later, was accompanied by soldiers marching into the parliament, and when he was challenged by deputies, he started to shout, and I quote, "Don't forget, I walk with the God of war and with the God of victory." He did not rule through the army. It was not a military regime. But we have to make a distinction between a military regime where the army is actually exercising power and a militarist one. There's perhaps a year after he took power in which he assiduously cultivated civilian support. It's what historians like Guénifé always quote. But this was in fact the period in which his rule was most fragile and most threatened, and in which he barely escaped an assassination attempt. What saved him was the Battle of Marengo in 1800 and the success of his Second Italian campaign. Thereafter, he actively sought to ground his political legitimacy in his military glory. He himself admitted as much many years later in exile. To quote from the memorial of St. Helena, "I was the keystone of a structure that was not just brand new, but built on such shaky foundations." This is Napoleon speaking. "Its survival depended upon each one of my many battles." After 1800 and after Marengo, he acted repeatedly to strengthen the position of the army in civilian society. He gave huge rewards to his most successful commanders, and he imposed forms of military discipline not only on the state administration, but significantly in secondary schools and lycées. He dreamed of reconstructing the city of Paris around a series of military monuments. You see here some of the most obvious. The Arc de Triomphe, at least planned out, if not built yet fully. The Church of the Madeleine, originally conceived of as a temple of glory, temple of Mars. Hired poets chanted the moral superiority of the military. To quote a poem read with great pomp before the Institute of France by one of the regime's most prominent intellectuals in 1800, right after Marengo, "Follow the generous example of our warriors. Life is nothing for them. Glory is all. Those who risk death are the true masters of the world." So, just two more words in conclusion. I know I've gone on too long, and I apologize. In Bonaparte, the elements of modern militarism all came together. The French, or at least the politically active part of them, had learned to see their society as divided into two separate complementary parts that could now be labeled military and civilian. Thanks to the new mystique of war, the military was now seen not only as a potential threat to civilian society, but in fact its potential savior, a force that could, by infusing its values of strength, discipline, and selflessness into civilian society, and by exposing it to the alchemy that was the sublime experience of war, actually rejuvenate it. This militarism was bound up with a powerful, charismatic figure who seemed to incarnate all these qualities in his person and to act as the agent through which they did their work. He was not the only such figure in the age of revolutions. He had predecessors. Paoli in his native Corsica. George Washington, while a very different figure and not a militarist, did provide a model of charismatic authority grounded, obviously in part, on military exploits, which other later American militarist figures would follow. And then there are the Napoleons of the Western world, Toussaint Louverture, Dessalines, Henri Christophe, Simon Bolivar. Haiti, in particular, as Laurent Dubois has recently reminded us, would become, in the century after its independence, the most intensive laboratory of militarism that the world has ever seen. But that is a matter for another talk, so thank you very much.